and welcome to our third podcast. I'm Gina Rocker, a pensions partner at Doyle Clayton, and with me is Alison Garrow, a senior associate specialising in employment law. Doyle Clayton is a law firm specialising in workplace solutions, so we cover all areas of employment law, both contentious and non-contentious, immigration, and pensions law. Today we'll be discussing auto-enrolment for about 15 minutes. We thought we would present a scenario where Alison plays the part of an HR director and asks various questions relating to auto-enrolment. And in that way, we hope we will best illustrate key issues that may arise in relation to this topic. So what is auto-enrolment? Since October 2012, employers have to auto-enroll workers who are not already members of a qualifying scheme. To illustrate the point a little more, let's use the example of an independent school. The school will employ teachers and support staff. Teachers are likely to be members of the teachers' pension scheme, but some may have opted out for whatever reason, and support staff do not qualify for membership of the teachers' pension scheme. It is likely that it is these workers that the employer will need to auto-enroll. Alison will now look at some typical questions an HR director might ask in relation to auto-enrolment. So Alison, over to you.
We're a small business with about 18 workers. How do we find out when our staging date is?
Well, that's a very good question. The pensions regulator has a very handy online facility which allows you as an employer to enter your pay-as-you-earn scheme number, and it will tell you your staging date.
And once we know the staging date, what do we need to do?
Well, that's when the hard work starts, really, Alison. You'll have to assess your workers. In summary, there are three categories. Now, there's quite a bit to take in, so I'll go through them quite slowly. The first category is your eligible job holder. These are people who are aged between 22 and the state pension age. They earn between £5,800 and £42,300, and this is known as the qualifying earnings. The third component is that their annual earnings exceed £10,000, known as the threshold earnings limit. With eligible job holders, the employer is required to auto-enrol them.
And what if someone earns more than £42,300? Do they need to be auto-enrolled?
Well, if they are not in a qualifying scheme, then yes, they would still need to be auto-enrolled. The thresholds that I've just mentioned, that goes up to £42,300, is really the threshold used to calculate the contributions. So if you earn in excess of £42,300, you will still need to be auto-enrolled, but the contributions will be worked out at the maximum of £42,300 and not on your actual salary.
I see.
So that brings us to the second category, known as the ineligible job holder. Now, this person is aged between 16 and 74, earns between £5,800 and £42,300, but earns below £10,000, which is the threshold limit. Alternatively, they are aged between 16 and 21, and the state pension age and 74. They earn between £5,800 and £42,300. However, they exceed the 10,000 threshold limit. They qualify as ineligible job holders and can request to be admitted to a qualifying scheme, and if they so request, then the employer is obliged to auto-enrol them and pay contributions towards them. I should just add here, Alison, a point about the age of 74, which a lot of people ask about. And that really is by reference to the age of 75, which is the age at which all pension benefits must be taken. That brings us to the third and final category, known as entitled worker. These are people aged between 16 and 74, and they earn less than £5,800 in a year. This category of worker can if they wish, request information from the employer and ask to be admitted to a pension scheme. However, it does not have to be a qualifying scheme for auto-enrolment purposes, and the employer is not obligated to contribute to that pension scheme. So, it is worth noting that the definition of worker is widely cast. It includes people working on ships, secondees, offshore workers, and so forth. Their HMRC status is not necessarily a determinant of whether they are a worker.
We use several consultants. Do we have to include them in our assessment?
Well, that's a very good question, Alison, because the position is not clear-cut. There are circumstances where the consultant can count as a worker, which would mean he should be included in the assessment of the workforce as to whether they are a worker. It is essentially a question of employment law, and consultants will need to be assessed based on their contractual arrangements. It depends whether they are engaged under a personal contract of service or a contract for services.
And what about agency workers?
It depends on who is responsible for paying them. If the agency pays their salary, then the auto-enrolment obligations lie with the agency. If your company pays the agency worker's salary, then you will need to include them in assessing whether they are eligible job holders and so forth.
There's quite a lot to do here. How much time do we have to comply?
Well, once you know the staging date, you will not be able to change it, although you can comply in advance of your allocated staging date by bringing the date forward, or you can postpone compliance by up to 3 months after the staging date.
We actually have a group personal pension arrangement. Can we use that?
Well, you may be able to use that, Alison, as your qualifying scheme, so you will have to take advice as to whether it is a qualifying scheme. If the GPP is not a qualifying scheme, it is unlikely that you can amend it to make it a qualifying scheme. Your choice will then be either taking out another GPP arrangement or using Nest.
And what's Nest?
Nest is basically the workplace pension scheme set up by the government for those employers who don't want to set up their own pension scheme, and they can simply participate in it by making contributions to it.
It sounds like we'll need to put a system in place to assess our workforce. Is this a one-off task, or is this something we're going to have to keep on our radar?
Well, Alison, this is one area that employers don't often appreciate, and that is, it is not a one-off exercise. It is an ongoing assessment that needs to be performed by the employer, because every 3 years the employer is obligated to re-enroll those workers who opted out at the first staging date. Also, the employer is required to constantly assess those workers who at first do not qualify but may do so at some point in the future, for example by earning more money, changing their work hours. So there is an ongoing assessment that needs to be performed by the employer, and the employer will need to have its systems geared up to cope with that ongoing assessment.
This sounds like it could be quite onerous. Is there an alternative?
Yes, there is an alternative, and a lot of employers are using what is known as contractual enrolment. What that is that the employer automatically enrolls all the employees and any new joiners contractually into a qualifying scheme by making that a term of the contract of employment. However, if they go down this route, they would need to obtain the consent of the joiner or the worker to deduct their pension contributions. So as you can see, auto-enrolment is a far-reaching obligation, so employers should plan well ahead of time.
And what are the risks if we don't comply with this?
Well, the legislation allows the pensions regulator to impose civil penalties, which basically means for individuals a fine of up to £5,000 or for corporates a fine of up to £50,000. Of course, if the employer engages any willful action to avoid its obligations, this will bring about criminal sanction in addition to civil penalties. So it is really something that should be taken fairly seriously.
Clearly this is important, and thank you, you've given me a lot of information. In order that I know where to start, what are the three main things I should focus on?
Well, I appreciate this has been quite a lot of information for employers to digest. But I think if we had to summarize as to the first three steps that you as an employer would need to take, I think I would say that the first would be find out your staging date. Number two, assess who your workers are. And number three, select your qualifying scheme.
Thank you. That's been really helpful.
Well, thank you, Alison. Hopefully you have found that interesting and our listeners have found that interesting and informative. I appreciate that there is a lot to take in, but if you do have any questions, please do contact us and we would be very happy to answer any queries. Our contact number is 0207 329 9090. And of course, you can always reach me by email on grocco@doyleclayton.co.uk. Thank you very much for listening.